Peter Hitchens, we're in person, we're in the pub.
We are.
After our last conversation, you're desperate to get back. We're here now.
Well, I was desperate. Keen, I think, would be.
Mm-hmm. Well, I've felt one of the things that I've really struggled with during this pandemic is loneliness, or not being in that social fabric, being out, just being around people you don't know. I mean, how have you found it? There's a significant mental side to this lockdown, isn't there?
It's dehumanising.
Yeah.
It is, and for people who are still reasonably healthy and young, it's a nuisance and a deprivation. But for people who are old and on the verge of becoming seriously old and constantly in danger of becoming ill and immobilised, being stripped of all these exchanges and chances to rub shoulders with other people is disastrous. This is what Professor Sigrid Bachti said at the very beginning, very eloquently, a professor at the University of Mainz in Germany, said at the very beginning of this, it's going to be devastating to the old. It's in the loneliness that will impose on them. Imagine a government as well telling people they can't touch their grandchildren.
That's a growing trend, isn't it, these interventions? Hi, mate.
Hi.
Could I get a pint of Guinness, please?
Yes, and anything for you?
What would you like, Peter?
Well, I don't know. Do you have anything in the 3.5 ABV zone?
No.
I feared you
The
might.
lowest is 4.
Well, if you've got a sort of German Reinheitsgebot lager that I could have a bottle of, a small bottle, that would be good. But I don't want to, anything above 3.5 at lunchtime, and I've had it.
The old tradition of Fleet Street. What is one of the things you've missed then? Have you felt that lack of social contact? Has that been
Well,
big thing for you?
I'm an antisocial misanthrope anyway, and I've been very lucky with my domestic arrangements while this has been going on, so that's not been my problem. And my problem is one of having what I regard as fairly strong political antennae, and seeing that in the circumstances in which we find ourselves, first of all, this completely improper interference by government in areas of private dealings and private trust. Trust is absolutely essential to civilization. And the almost total lack of opposition to this. But also, it hasn't been felt. People have put up with this. And I think this is a transformation for the worse of our society, from which I don't think we shall ever recover. And we are going to shortly, no one realizes yet because we're still in the lovely smooth shallows that lead to the lip of Niagara, we will
Thanks, mate. Cheers.
find when the economic crisis comes that our failure to be politically active and resistant to this imposition will cost us a great deal, because of course the economic crisis will be again a very major pretext for the deprivation of liberty.
So there's so many various areas of intervention that we've seen, from the economy to that area of private life that you're mentioning. But if we could drill into that lack of opposition that you're touching on.
Well, it just hasn't been there, and none of the brakes have worked. I think very early on this, somebody said, "Where are the brakes on this thing?" There haven't been. Well, you could pump on the brake marked Parliament. And when, to the extent that any of this was put before Parliament, which is very, very likely, there was almost no opposition to extraordinary, immensely ambitious demands for extra power for the government. No debate, no opposition, no vote. The opposition itself, Her Majesty's opposition, whose leader is paid to oppose the government, has never opposed it. He's merely criticised its implementation of a policy which he has accepted. Much of the media have entirely accepted the official version that because the virus is so serious, and without examining the seriousness of the outbreak, because it is so serious, these measures are justified. But when someone like Lord Sumption, a man of such intellectual candle power that he was selected for the Reith Lectures by the BBC only last year, a distinguished historian, a former judge of the Supreme Court, beyond doubt one of the clearest and most effective thinkers and indeed public speakers of our time, when he barely gets on to the BBC, and then only as far as I was really at the time when what he said was most urgent, on a small Radio 4 program called The World at One. Apart from that, I've searched in vain for any mentions of his very important protests made on the major TV bulletin or on the Today program, where it ought to have been. When even he can only get into the margins of the media, then it seems to me that this is worse than a failure. This is people actively trying to avoid giving prominence or importance or a platform to opposition. This isn't a free country, in effect, anymore.
We'll go further into this. The barman has just told me they don't have any beers of that strength that you just specified.
Well,
soft drink?
I just have if they've got a bottled lager, not Corona, for goodness sake.
I'll ask.
And I'd rather have skim milk
than a Corona beer, yeah. Cheers. Good to see you.
And you too.
That's on the money. Okay, so yes, we were talking about this. I mean, you could call it the establishment. You could call it the orthodoxy of opinion in this country. What do you think that speaks to? Do you think that speaks to a broader malaise with our political system? Do you think it's something specific to this issue?
I don't know. You know how instinctively, I know how much you like your own instincts. I've learned to trust mine. I regard the state and its power as like weeds in a garden. The gardener's job is to keep it cut back, to make sure it doesn't become too powerful, to make sure that the plants which do grow are the benevolent plants, the fruitful ones or the beautiful ones, and to keep the weeds down. And I've always regarded the state's tendency to seize more and more power over our personal lives as like a sort of bindweed or Japanese knotweed, which erupts in your gut. You have to keep cutting it back. And it's a natural tendency of power to grab more power. You know the expression, never let a good crisis go to waste.
Absolutely.
And there are people who say this is all planned. I say that's rubbish. I don't think anybody planned this. I think this virus is a natural occurrence. I'm blaming China and all the rest of it. It seems to me to be garbage. If you can prove it to be true, then prove it to be true. But until then, it's just the sort of thing that intelligent people have to lay to one side. What is undoubtedly the case, though, is confronted with an opportunity to seize extra power over our lives.
That unrelenting pursuit of power, do you think Boris Johnson's leadership is a manifestation of that?
Well, you say pursuit of power, I say pursuit of office. And these people are in office, they're not in power. They are, and this is particularly the case now. And if you don't understand what it is you're doing, you aren't really in power, are you?
How can they not be powerful if they've
curtailed our free... They have power.
Yeah.
They have the power of the state, but they are simply sitting there on top of a machine which is doing things they don't understand. They were panicked into this. There are all kinds of rumours and stories about how the panic came about, but the fact is they did panic. They suddenly decided that they were going to go for these extraordinarily radical measures of interference and of mass house arrest and crashing the economy, which they adopted, which a few days before they didn't appear even to be contemplating, and that's something they did, they panic. And having set this thing in motion, they can't stop it. They can't, because to achieve this, they spread an enormous amount of fear. And the only way they could ever undo that fear, if there is any way that they could undo it at all, would be by admitting that they made a terrible mistake. Standing up in public and saying, we're terribly sorry, we made a terrible mistake, this virus is not as serious as we said it was, the danger is not as great as we said it was, the precautions taken against it were disproportionate and excessive, we have made a terrible mistake. And when did you last hear a politician say anything like that? So they can't or won't do that, so they must continue with it. And it's like the other metaphor for this is that when I was first involved in politics, you could walk into Downing Street. You could stand outside, as I did one day in 1973. You could stand outside the door of Downing Street and shout rude slogans. And then you could walk off. And it was open at both ends. Bit by bit, over the 70s and 80s, tin barriers appeared at the end. And then, of course, came the age of modern terrorism, when huge, elaborate, sort of Byzantine gates were erected. And I thought, when those went up, I thought they'll never come down again. Because however little terrorism there is for the rest of the history of the world, nobody will have the nerve to say, let's take these gates down, in case something happens, and he is then blamed for what happened after the gates came down. It's the same with these precautions. As soon as you put them there, it's almost impossible for anyone to advocate removing them. They're trapped by their own rhetoric and their own actions into an endless, unfinishing, eternal misery in which we now have to live.
It's, I would be inclined to say that it's the mark of a good leader to be able to change your position in face of new evidence.
Absolutely, yes, which is one of the reasons why there are so few good leaders.
And what about Boris Johnson? Is it peace in our time, or Churchillian, our darkest hour, and we'll fight them on the beaches?
Churchill had many faults, and anybody who knows anything about him acknowledges this. But he was an enormously voracious reader, particularly of history and of literature. And therefore he knew at second hand an awful lot of things that are important to know. He knew things which it is important for a king to know. But interestingly, by the way, de Gaulle, who was also the most tremendous, he read 3 books a week and couldn't stop. De Gaulle, after many, many clashes with Churchill, concluded that he wasn't actually very intelligent, which I think may be true, but he was magnificent. He had terrific instincts. On the one crucial occasion when it mattered most of all in the world, he did the right thing. He was physically brave. He'd experienced an enormous amount, but he may not have been that bright. But Johnson simply doesn't even begin to enter into that same class. He fantasizes about being Churchill, but he isn't Churchill. He's much more like Billy Liar than he is like Winston Churchill.
Do you think there's any way that he could, in your eyes, come out of this favourably?
No, I think the damage is irrevocably done.
Yeah.
I mean, I described the actions of the government at the beginning as like those of an incompetent doctor who amputates his patient's leg to cure a bout of flu. The problem with this is that although it's funny as a cartoon or as a joke, in fact, if anybody did that, it would be a gigantic tragedy and a huge piece of incompetence. And in fact, what this government has done, particularly to the economy, but also, I think, to liberty and the political system, is irreversibly destructive and tragic, and it cannot be undone. That's the whole point. There are many actions which cannot be undone. And they've spent more money than exists in the world. And then they borrowed more money than exists in the world to make up for the fact that they have destroyed what was already a very troubled economy.
And whilst the national focus is on the pandemic, we've now passed the date by which we can request an extension for our departure from the European Union. Well, that looms, doesn't it?
Yeah, I know, but it's going to dissolve into trivia compared with what's going to happen. But meanwhile, in the huge, great national boiler behind, the needle is sweeping round to the red zone. The alarms are beginning to shriek, and everybody's saying, what should we do? What button do we press? Which tap do we turn? Which lever do we pull? They don't know. Because the trouble with economics is that it's all about the past. People know what worked in the past, and so nobody knows what's going to work this time. So nobody has a clue.
You've described Rishi Sunak as a payday lender in one of our previous conversations. That's what you called him. But he's viewed very favourably. He's viewed as making a success of this crisis.
He's only considered successful. That's the old joke. The man who hurls himself off the top of the Empire State Building is asked as he passes the 34th floor downwards, how are things? And so far, so good. But the only reason why Rishi Sunak still has this reputation for success is that his actions have not reached their end. Halfway through, people are still totting up the sums. You know, the multiplication sign here, division sign there. And when people actually finally tot them up and see what the sum is of all this, then it's a disaster. But for the moment, political reporters like to play this soap opera game: who's up, who's down, who's in, who's out. And it's quite obvious that Johnson's reputation has fallen greatly in this. So it's just one of the things they do to build up the reputation of a rival or potential successor. But the mathematics, the simple arithmetic, which all of us can understand, remains, and the physics and the gravity remain, I'm afraid, irresistible. He's not a success. He's not an economic genius.
The follow-up
We're
then
not
is...
bound for 30 years of increasing prosperity under his
Stewardship.
brilliant guidance. Helmsmanship, I think.
The follow-up is then how, isn't it? Not just in the economy, but in terms of private life. I guess the big question from the economic side of things is how are we going to pay for it? Where will the money come from?
The obvious thing, which has almost always happened on every occasion of this kind before, has been very, very strong inflation. If you have an enormous debt, the only way you can really cancel it is if you inflate it out of existence. It's great for the government and it's great for everybody who's in debt. But for the people who foolishly saved for pensions, or indeed saved at all, it's catastrophic. And those people are often the bedrock of civil society, the middle classes. So if you propose to impoverish the middle classes, you can expect bad things to happen.
There's a couple of things I'd like to catch up with you on before we finish. Since we last spoke, Black Lives Matter protests have sort of spread across the country. You were at one in Oxford. Tell us about that.
Well, it wasn't really a Black Lives Matter protest.
Do go on.
It was a march demanding the removal of the statue of Cecil Rhodes.
It was Rhodes Must Fall, was it? Sorry, my mistake.
Oriel College. Yeah.
Well, talk to me about what you saw when you were there.
Well, I get such a lot of undeserved abuse that I'm quite happy to take a bit of undeserved credit. I mean, there was one great thing went around Twitter that I'd refused to take the knee. I hadn't. If I'd refused to take anything, I'd refuse to take the buttock, because everyone had sat down on the street to commemorate George Floyd. And I didn't sit down. I mean, I have many reasons why I didn't sit down, but I didn't sit down. And there was this picture of me not sitting down, and then gained some progress. Then a week later, there was another one of these demonstrations, which I found out about by accident and toddled along to. And they got so bored, they'd laid themselves up such a long route, which at one stage took them to a completely deserted shopping centre. They got so bored that they started shouting at me, and that was all.
You
It was not terrifying to me.
Oh no, I'm sure it wasn't.
I used to go on demonstrations. Much more frightening than that.
That's exactly where I was going to, Peter. Well, perhaps as a reporter on those demonstrations, but also your time as a student radical. I wanted to ask you, had in those days when you were a part of the protest, you were part of that group, would you have shouted it yourself? Would you have shouted at a reporter?
I think I'd be too busy. These things, they were. The great thing about demonstrations in those days is that we were not expressing generally accepted views. We would demonstrations are actually demonstrations of impotence, or were in my day. You were a small group of people who had a set of opinions which you wanted to get across. And nobody, the people passing by on the street, the individual police officers who saw you, almost certainly the journalists who reported, nobody agreed with you. You were outcast. And they could on occasion turn quite nasty as well. Bad people came to them. And I went to the famous Battle of Grosvenor Square in March 1968. And I still can't, I can't remember how I got there. I can't remember how I got back. This wasn't because I was stupefied or anything. I just cannot, my memory is just a grey haze on either side. What I can very clearly remember, I can close my eyes now and I can hear the beat of the hooves of the police horses charging when it turned nasty, which it did very suddenly. There you were in the square, a bit of shouting, but then suddenly. And it was, I got away very lightly. I didn't get hurt. But a lot of people got hurt and a lot of people got scooped up and arrested. Not me. And there were other occasions. I mean, there was an occasion when, after the Bloody Sunday massacre in York, when a lot of us went down from the university and into the centre of the city, and we protested outside the Army recruiting office, which seemed an obvious target. And I don't know how it started, but it became quite a serious, frightening melee. I don't think any of us had wanted it to start. I still don't know, but often people, as say, people with an interest in causing trouble, hitch themselves onto demonstrations and do so. But they can get quite frightening. These were not. These were processions. Good-natured, good-tempered, harmless, not worrying.
You have a very serious.
Oh, this is a real gas mask.
Yeah. Filterless, but real.
Well, I don't have the filter now because
Yeah.
it sticks out about a foot in front, and it's quite large.
You've readied it. Are you going to put it on?
Well, I see why not. It's insist. I mean, though I have to tell you that I feel severe distress as I do so I won't keep it on for long.
Oh, okay, very good. Look at that.
There you are. You got it. Okay.
So, severe distress, Peter.
Oh, it's terrible.
Severe distress.
So, the severe distress is genuine. I've had the idea of being compelled by any government to wear some sort of muzzle across my face is extremely distressing. It makes me very angry.
Let's run through this then.
People haven't told me what to wear since I was about 15.
Coming back to that sort of...
especially on my face.
haircuts, etc. Let's delve into this a little bit, because your position is they shouldn't be telling you what to wear. The Royal Society have come out today, the president of the Royal Society, and said that wearing masks should be akin to wearing a seatbelt. But you're opposed to it. I mean, why?
The whole point of the Royal Society is it upholds the scientific method, surely. And if randomised control testing, in the interview on the radio in which he supported the wearing of masks, he said he was against randomised control. I was astonished. But no, there is a huge amount of stuff which you can find, including a very extensive paper done for the dental trade 4 years ago, in which they concluded that the use of going right back to the original use of masks, I think at the beginning of the 20th century, they conclude that the arguments for them are very weak. There's also been a very concise article by Dr. John Lee on the Spectator website on the mask issue, in which he sums up the arguments for and against. And his conclusion, which seems to me to be the most persuasive, is that there is very much a division of opinion on this, and on the basis of that, you cannot compel. If there were, people say, well, it's like seatbelts. The Guardian came out with the leader the other day saying it's not wearing a mask is like not wearing a seatbelt. It's ridiculous. There is no question at all that seatbelts save lives. The evidence is incontrovertible. Nothing of that standard exists for the wearing of a nappy on your face.
But why not? If it can make a difference, even if it's a small benefit, why would you not just wear the mask?
My whole life has been one of taking proportionate, rational risks. And almost all the things that I've enjoyed or achieved in life have been a result of taking risks. And I ride a bicycle, for goodness sake, 4 times a day in busy streets. This is far greater danger to me, in my view, in riding that bicycle than there is in going about the streets in fear of coronavirus. I do not think there is a major danger that I will catch coronavirus from being in the same office as somebody else, from traveling on the same train as somebody else, and not wearing a nappy on my face. I choose to ride the bicycle because I think the benefits of doing so, both to me and to society in general, far outweigh the dangers of doing so.
Do you wear a helmet when you ride your bike?
No. Same reason. It doesn't. The case for it is extremely weak.
There we are then. Conviction.
I mean, you want to wear a styrofoam bowl on your head? Go ahead. I won't come and pull it off.
I do. I do when I was.
But I don't quite know how you ride your bicycle, but I ride mine in an upright position, probably most of the time, and not much faster than 10 or 11 miles an hour. And I have to tell you, when I come off it, my head is not going to be the bit that hits the road. I know from experience, actually, what hits the road.
What was it? Hands, shoulder.
Your shoulder.
Yeah, I've been knocked off as well, but we're getting distracted. Peter Hitchens, thank you so much for your time. I enjoyed the conversation enormously. Thank you.
Likewise, thanks a lot.